Hi, folks. Welcome. I'm Kara Horowitz from UCLA. We're going to get underway in just a few minutes as we let people in. Great. And I see our attendee list climbing slightly. I'm probably going to give it one more minute.
Real quick, just checking that my background is not reversed.
It looks good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and with that, I think we're ready to jump in. Hi, folks. I'm Kara Horowitz. I'm the Executive Director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA School of Law, which is the home for all things environmental at UCLA. I'm really pleased to be here with all of you today, especially want to thank our panelists and our keynote speaker, Steve Cliff from ARB. I'm here as one half of the organizing team behind a series of reports that UCLA and Berkeley have jointly put together over many years now on the topic of climate solutions for California. And in this series, we focus especially on climate solutions for California that involve and touch on the private sector. And we're here today because we just released the most recent of these reports. It's called Financing and Fueling Electric Trucks. It dives deep into the topic of how to decarbonize heavy-duty vehicles. And I think probably everybody who's here today and on this webinar understands that the goal of decarbonizing that sector is both incredibly important and ambitious, and also really difficult because of a set of interrelated challenges that relate both to charging infrastructure needs and adequate financing. So the report that we're really excited to release today looks deeply at charging infrastructure needs and at financing needs, and make some suggestions for ways to overcome some of these barriers. I'm really thrilled to be able to talk about the report today in partnership with folks at Berkeley. As I said, this is a longstanding partnership, and this report would not have come together without the hard work of Ethan Elkind and Shruti and others on the Berkeley team. So thank you to them. I'll turn it over to them in just a second. I'll say one more thing, though, about my perch here in Los Angeles. As folks know, Los Angeles really sits very close to two of the largest ports in the United States, the ports of Long Beach and the port of Los Angeles. And we work here at UCLA very closely with many affected communities. These are communities that are often environmental justice communities. They suffer some of the worst effects of this, of heavy duty vehicles that come in and out of the ports all day. And so it's clear that these are both really important challenges to meet, and the importance of work in the private sector to meet these challenges is especially clear. So with that in mind, I'm really excited to have representatives of the public and private sector here with us today. I'm going to turn it over to our partners in crime at Berkeley and to my good friend, Ethan Elkind, who's the director of the climate program at Berkeley. And Ethan, why don't you take it away with thanks.
All right. Thanks so much, Kara. Really appreciate it. So yeah, Ethan Elkind, directing the climate program, as Kara mentioned, at Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, otherwise known as CLEE. CLEE develops law and policy solutions to a host of environmental challenges, putting out policy reports like this one, Fueling and Financing, that we released just recently, and are happy to have this webinar to discuss some of those findings today. We also host conferences and work with students and all the good stuff in terms of trying to impact public policy and environmental challenges in California and beyond. So as Kara mentioned, this is a long-standing partnership. It actually dates back to 2009. And I want to call out our sponsor of this initiative, Bank of America, that has been supporting this effort since 2009. And I don't even know what number report this is. I think we're up in the high 20s now, where we have gathered stakeholders for focused discussions on these pressing topics, charging infrastructure, and then how to finance and access financing for heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles, electric vehicles. And then based on that stakeholder discussion, we do desk research and then package that into the report. And you can find all the reports in the series at our website, climatepolicysolutions.org. So check out that website, not only for this report, but for past reports in the series, which have touched on all sorts of issues: renewable energy, energy storage, energy efficiency, wildfire mitigation, on and on. So any solution you want to find, we've probably got it there on the website. So do check that out. A couple notes about the webinar today. We're about to hear a keynote presentation from Dr. Steve Cliff. I'll introduce him in a moment, and then we'll give an overview of the report. Myself and Shruti Sarod, our climate research fellow, helped author it. And then we're going to have a panel discussion featuring Niki Okuk from CalSTART and Jacqueline Torres from Forum Mobility. And we'll take your questions too. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A function. And hopefully everyone is familiar with how to use that. And then we will curate those and provide an opportunity for you to, for the speakers to field those questions. And if you have any resources to share or other comments, feel free to use the chat. But if you have specific questions, do use the Q&A function. We're also going to do something that's at least original for me. I've never tried this before, but we're going to do a poll of all of you to find out a little bit about your backgrounds. So Maya Baltzley, who's our CLEE administrator and helping to run this webinar, is going to put that poll out there. So please feel free to answer those questions as you listen to the remarks coming up. And then I think that will give us some interesting background on all of you. So as we go through the remarks, we can tailor them a little bit, mainly for the panel discussion. I think that's about it for housekeeping. And with that, and if there's any questions on that, do use the Q&A function or the chat, but also substantive questions too, of course. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Stephen Cliff, Executive Officer of the California Air Resources Board. We're so excited that Steve is here because Air Resources Board is absolutely central to this issue. It's really a pioneer globally in terms of issuing regulations to convert our heavy-duty fleets and vehicles to zero-emission versions. And just a few quick notes about Dr. Cliff. He was appointed to the Air Resources Board as Executive Officer in the summer of 2022. But prior to that, he had a long career at Air Resources Board. And in the middle of that, we lost him to the federal government, but we're very excited that he's back. He served as the 16th Administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, affectionately abbreviated as NHTSA. It's probably my favorite acronym. It always sounds like I'm kind of sneezing a little bit, but Steve, I won't let you don't have to comment on that. That's just my personal observation. So he was appointed by President Biden in January of 2021 and confirmed by the US Senate in 2022. So he has wonderful federal experience and perspective on this. But like I say, we're very happy that Dr. Cliff has come back to California. So Steve, I will let you take it from here.
Thanks so much, Ethan. Really appreciate that. And I'd like to start by thanking the UC Berkeley School of Law's Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, known as CLEE, and the UCLA School of Law's Emmett Institute, which Kara represents. And thanks to Ethan, Kara, and Shruti, and all the folks behind the scenes for this wonderful event. We really need these types of partnerships to drive forward the policies that we're enacting. We can set those standards, set the policies, set the goals, and we need folks to implement. And so these are the types of solutions that I think are really important. I also just want to note the very first one of these types of reports I was involved in, I think was in 2014. So I just realized that's been a decade that I've been working with Ethan and CLEE and Emmett on these various things. So I know they've done a number of these great reports, and I saw the link there, so folks will look at that. And I really want to commend the report authors for not just focusing on the barriers, but also identifying a multitude of potential solutions across key stakeholders at the highest levels of state government and private investors. It's really important. And it highlights for me how prominent better communication is as a part of the solution for overcoming the identified barriers, whether it be increased collaboration, data transparency, information sharing, or education. Better communication is there as a common thread that can positively impact all the work that we do. But let's now focus on why we're at this pivotal place with regard to zero-emission trucks. Trucking has an outsized impact on climate change, air pollution, and community health. While they make up only about 6% of California's vehicles, they're about a quarter of our transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions and nearly half of our smog-forming emissions in California. Diesel truck pollution is concentrated in low-income communities and communities of color that are surrounded by freeways, ports, and freight activity. And these communities are most exposed to the health risks associated with this pollution, including increased incidence of asthma, cancer, and hospitalization, as well as increased susceptibility to respiratory illnesses like COVID-19 due to poor air quality. The California strategy for reducing emissions from trucks and towards zero emissions is comprehensive and multifaceted, including regulations, incentives, and commitments to build market certainty. In 2020, California Governor Newsom signed an executive order calling for drayage trucks to be 100% zero emission operations by 2035, and all heavy duty trucks to be zero emission by 2045. To help us achieve this, we've developed at CARB 2 key regulatory strategies in the heavy duty sector. First, in 2020, we adopted the Advanced Clean Trucks rule. That covers everything from work trucks to heavy duty line haul trucks. And that regulation requires that manufacturers must sell zero emission vehicles as an increasing percentage of their overall heavy duty sales in California. Manufacturers have already exceeded the 2024 requirements 2 years ahead of time, and the May release of sales data in that report shows that 1 out of 6 trucks sold in California for the 2023 model year was zero emissions. In addition, 10 other states have already adopted the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation, representing about a quarter of the entire US truck market. In 2023, CARB also adopted the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation. That regulation establishes zero emission purchase requirements for certain fleets operating in California, including those operating in drayage, government fleets, and private fleets that are well suited to move to zero emissions. The ACF regulation also puts an end to all combustion truck sales in California by 2036. So that's 100% zero emission truck sales by 2036. The Advanced Clean Fleets regulation is expected to increase the number of zero emission trucks in California to about 500,000 by the year 2035. California's zero emission vehicle regulations are complemented by numerous other regulations and policies, really too many to list today. However, this transition will be challenging, and it's important to think comprehensively and be open to new strategies to overcome identified barriers. One of the complementary strategies is addressing upfront zero emission vehicle truck costs through incentives or other financing strategies. California has been investing in this zero emission space for over a decade, investing over $1 billion in clean truck purchase incentives. These incentives have pivoted over time from full demo programs to larger pilots to widespread vehicle buy downs. And at this point, we're now reassessing these investments and focusing those incentives mostly to small fleets. We're also looking at other ways to support small businesses to address upfront vehicle costs. And I'd like to highlight one such way that aligns closely with some of the solutions identified in the recent report. This past May, working in conjunction with the California State Treasurer's Office, California Capital Access Program, CARB opened the Zero Emission Truck Loan Pilot Program, focusing on small fleets. This program builds off a highly successful conventional truck loan program that CARB supported from 2009 through 2023 that enrolled over 43,000 small business loans and leveraged about $3.2 billion in private financing, with about half of that benefiting priority communities. With these funds available, lenders are better equipped to lend to businesses that need a little extra assistance and offer more favorable terms than the business world would otherwise qualify for. We're also working closely with the California Energy Commission to align an accompanying infrastructure loan program. And Southern California Edison has also funded a similar loan program for customers in its service territory. That's a nice segue to complementary infrastructure strategies. Infrastructure is obviously such a critical component of our transition that its importance cannot be overstated. Policies and strategies are looking to address both near-term charging installs and rates and long-term grid readiness. One of the many lessons that we've learned from implementing our zero-emission incentives and regulatory programs is that coordination is critical and information sharing across the board is absolutely necessary. And it wasn't surprising that many of the solutions identified in the report were based on improving these aspects of the deployment policies. So with that, I'd like to close out by thanking the report authors and congratulating them on a wonderful report and for all their work identifying the really hard barriers and solutions. And I look forward to hearing more in the overview. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Really appreciate your remarks and putting into context what California is doing and some of the latest information about our progress on this issue. It's great to have that to tee up our report overview here. And absolutely, you were there at 2014 when we did a report on how to shape California's transportation spending. So we're still on this topic of transportation, but now from a more technology-oriented perspective. So I want to take a moment here to provide some remarks about the report and a short summary here. I'm going to introduce our CLEE Climate Research Fellow, Shruti Sarod, who did yeoman's work on this report. I also just want to give a couple shout outs here. A former CLEE Research Fellow, Lydia Casahun, who has moved on working with a nonprofit now, helped with the convening on the financing solution. So I want to give a shout out to Lydia and thank her for her work on this. And also want to acknowledge Dr. Cliff's colleague, Michelle Buffington at the Air Resources Board, who was the one who really brought this issue to our attention at the universities as something that would really benefit from a stakeholder discussion. So a couple shout outs there, and I will pass it to Shruti to provide an overview of the infrastructure recommendations in the report, and then I'll highlight some of the financing ones.
Thanks, Ethan. Great. So yeah, I'll provide an overview of the report that we just published earlier this month. Maya, could you go on the next slide, please? As Steve already mentioned in his remarks, that heavy-duty vehicles like semi-trucks and buses are a big source of air pollution, especially in low-income and disadvantaged communities. But the good news is that zero-emission electric trucks and buses are already hitting the roads and becoming more available. But to keep up with this transition, we'll need a lot more charging infrastructure for these vehicles. In fact, the California Energy Commission estimates that we'll need around 114,000 chargers by 2030 to support this growing numbers of electric vehicles. And to help make this a reality, we hosted 2 convenings with experts and stakeholders to figure out the biggest challenges to building out the charging infrastructure and financing this charging infrastructure deployment. Next slide, please. So our new report is based on these convenings and additional research, and it has 2 parts. First, we discuss the barriers and solutions to the deployment of heavy-duty electric vehicle and charging infrastructure, and then we discuss how to finance this deployment. And so here you can see the challenges to the charging infrastructure deployment that we have mentioned in the report. So many agency and legislative funding allocation timelines are not synchronized, which leads to inefficient deployment of the charging infrastructure. And the experts at our convening particularly emphasized on the lack of holistic electrification charging plan across agencies, and no agency having ultimate responsibility for leading these public sector efforts. Our convening participants also noted the lack of utility data and transparency that can lead to a higher risk and uncertainty with charging infrastructure investment. And there's also a need for non-ratepayer funding for utilities. Next slide, please. Here are some of the solutions that we have mentioned in the report as they were discussed in the convening. The governor could create an executive level charging working group with the governor's authority to ensure coordination and hold the responsible state agencies accountable for deployment of the charging infrastructure to support the heavy-duty vehicle sector. And the CPUC or the legislature could require utilities to improve data transparency to facilitate charger deployment. The utilities and state leaders could also seek federal funds for grid upgrades given the continued escalation of electricity rates in California. CARB could also accelerate charging infrastructure deployment via the fast charging infrastructure pathway under the low carbon fuel standard of the state. The state legislature could pay for grid upgrades through the general fund or non-traditional sources of existing funding, like the transportation infrastructure investment. Next slide, please. So for the financing section, I'll hand it over to Ethan.
All right, thank you so much, Shruti. So let's talk about financing. These are sort of the twin challenges, really, to greater deployment of electric heavy-duty vehicles. And so you heard from Shruti the challenges around the charging infrastructure, but the other piece of it is that these are more expensive vehicles. While not all the data is necessarily public, what we've heard is that a new electric version of, say, a diesel truck can cost upwards of 3 times of what it would cost for the fossil fuel equivalent. Others may be able to provide better numbers on those, but that's some of what we've heard. So, of course, if you think about total cost of ownership of these vehicles, that there's going to be reduced fueling cost, in terms of electricity versus diesel, and reduced maintenance cost. That total cost of ownership, this is all projected to sort of pencil out, certainly by the 2030s. There's thought that as battery prices come down, as the battery density increases, that we're going to be able to see total cost of ownership meet parity with fossil fuel equivalent vehicles and ultimately provide savings. But what do we do in the interim? We need to provide financing. And how do we get access to low cost financing in particular? The 3 key challenges that we heard from stakeholders on this issue is that the public programs, the public financing programs and grants, et cetera, often aren't shaped with the idea of trying to leverage additional private sector lending. So there isn't that sort of coordination between the public sector programs and an eye on bringing more private sector capital into the space. Secondly, many of the folks on the private capital side, investors, lenders, and purchasers, lack information, basic information on electric trucks. So they're sitting on the sidelines, not really understanding the market, not really understanding the technology. And then the third thing that our stakeholders that we talked to communicated to us in terms of challenges is that there's a lack of data on the residual value of these vehicles and what the secondary market is gonna look like. So if you're lending, it's really hard to be a lender when you don't know what that asset is going to resell for in a few years' time once it's a used vehicle. And so the more we have data on the used vehicle market and the more we shape our current financing programs to try to accelerate a really robust secondary market for these vehicles, the more will help private capital flow. So if you can go to the next slide, then we'll talk about just some of the highlight solutions. We have a lot more on both of these subjects in the report, but just quickly 4 of these solutions here that we wanted to highlight. HVIP, we'll talk about that incentive program in a moment, but that's the abbreviation for the Air Resources Board's hybrid and zero emission truck and bus voucher incentive program. That's one of the major rebate programs for purchasers of heavy duty zero emission vehicles. And the idea is that can we modify some of the restrictions around who qualifies for that funding, the HVIP dollars, to ensure that fleets that are readily able to electrify, that want to electrify, can qualify for them. Right now, there's some limits on fleet size, for example, that limits the ability of the larger fleets that would be the first to jump in from accessing these incentives. So the question is, can we kind of make sure we're getting the biggest bang for our HVIP buck by helping those that are most able to electrify first to take that plunge? And you could have a limit on how many vouchers, HVIP vouchers, a large company would get so that we don't crowd out the smaller fleets as well, but that we don't also categorically take off the table the larger fleets from accessing this program. There was calls to reduce the federal excise tax on these heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles. To address the lack of investor knowledge, we need more educational materials about heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles. And then to address the resale market and lack of data, a lot of different options in the report about how we can encourage more lending and more lending with an eye towards the secondary market, maybe conditions that these vehicles will be put into the secondary market soon. So expanding and expediting loan loss reserve programs to get some of these lenders off of the sidelines, and doing so in a way that would encourage a robust secondary market so we can get that data in, could all be very helpful towards addressing that challenge. So if you go to the last slide, I think we have a link there to the report. Well, we don't have a link, but we have a picture of the cover, so you get a little taste of what that's like. And then, as I said, we have a link in the chat for a report, and then also go to climatepolicysolutions.org if you want to access this report and all the other ones in the series. So I think we could stop sharing the slide. And with that, I want to, we were going to do some Q&A. Some questions came in, but they're looking like they're better suited for the panel. So with that, I am going to thank Dr. Steve Cliff, for joining us, and move right ahead into the panel, and then we'll be able to answer these questions at that point. And I want to take a moment now to introduce our two panelists. We're so pleased to have Niki Okuk join us from CALSTART. Niki is the Deputy Director of Trucks and Off-Road. And CALSTART, for those who don't know, is a nonprofit that works with its member companies and agencies to build a high-tech, clean transportation industry. And Niki works specifically to accelerate the adoption and use of zero-emission vehicles and equipment, and support infrastructure development needs for programs like HVIP. And I also want to introduce Jacqueline Torres, who is a Vice President of Finance at Forum Mobility. And Jacqueline actually participated in both of our convenings, so you're sort of a double winner, Jacqueline, for participating in both infrastructure and finance topics. Forum Mobility is a company that works to electrify heavy-duty fleets and bring zero-emission goods movement solutions to U.S. ports, and collaborates with stakeholders across the industry. And Jacqueline has been really helpful in thinking through particularly some of the finance recommendations. So thank you both for joining, and I do encourage more questions from all of you in our audience. There's some really good ones coming in, so we're going to make sure that we'll address those. And I want to start off just first by asking you both, and Jacqueline, I'll maybe you can kick this off, just to sort of shed light. What are some of the opportunities that you see in terms of boosting financing and access to financing generally, and as well as, since infrastructure is a big part of this, opportunities to boost the charging infrastructure too, especially since that's a big part of the financing challenges. And then I'll pass it to Niki to go next on that question.
Thanks for the intro, Ethan. Yeah, well, I'll start by just saying a few words about Forum Mobility, expanding on your introduction, Ethan. So Forum Mobility is building a network of charging stations to electrify goods transportation. We are focused right now in California, where there's, of course, the mandate that Steve mentioned to bring all trucks entering and exiting ports, that those be zero-emission vehicles by 2035. So that's where we're focusing. We're also entering into Washington as well. So we have a network of depots that are in development, including our flagship project that is located within the Port of Long Beach. So it's a 9-megawatt facility where we will have 25 360 kW chargers, and it will be operating by the end of this year. So it's a site located right within the heart of Long Beach, right within the heart of the Port of Long Beach. And kind of the beauty, or the business model that Forum Mobility is operating off of, is that fleets need secure charging. They need reliable charging. I don't know if anybody here, I'm sure people on this call have electric vehicles and have run into frustrations in the past with finding a charger that works or finding a charger that's open. Well, that's, we can deal with that on our, in our daily lives, that frustration. It's annoying. But if you are an operator and you have a reservation at the port, or you have a reservation to drop off a load, you have to be making those appointments. And so frustrations about a charger not working, or a telecommunications error, that kind of thing is not going to happen at Forum Mobility's depots, because we're going to have staff depots where you are going to reserve your charging space, and you will reliably be able to charge your truck based on having dedicated access to that charger. So so that's pretty much for mobility's, core value that's bringing to its customers is making it easy for operators of fleets to transition to zero emission vehicles. It's really challenging to go from knowing what your costs are on a dollar per mile basis, when now we're talking what is your cost on dollar per kilowatt hour. So we have a lot of regime changes going to zero emission, and for mobility's, what we want to do is make that as easy as possible. And so one point of that is making sure that customers have dedicated, reliable charging. We're going to have staff depots. We're going to have, we're going to have gates so that the depot is secure. And we also provide the truck. So you get your dedicated charging and you get access. For mobility, we'll finance the truck. So truck and charging brings the whole package together. So I'd say that's one exciting opportunity, Ethan, is the ability for operators to go to providers like For Mobility to transition and get a full package where For Mobility is really doing the legwork for you. So I think what For Mobility offers and some of the opportunities within that is Forum identifies the opportunities and passes those things along to customers. So I'm happy to, maybe I'm just going to really briefly touch on what some of those exciting opportunities are, and happy to dive into any one of them more fully. But for example, identifying the incentives that customers are available for. So Steve was mentioning and Ethan, the HVIP program. There are massive amounts of incentives, in particular for small fleets. So we can help fleets understand how many incentives they can qualify for. And those large incentives are really, really, really essential for making the cost, for making the economics work in relation to the alternative diesel truck. I think some other really cool opportunities are the loan loss reserve programs that were mentioned. And maybe one other opportunity that I'll talk about is that For Mobility is, if you've been following the industry for the past 2 years, hearing the challenges of why is it so challenging to finance a zero emission vehicle? Well, the number one issue is the high cost of the vehicle, and that comes with many other challenges. So we have to have incentives. But the other challenge that comes with that you hear people talk about all the time is the residual value. And so I know, many different folks are working on different ways to help support the residual value. I'll take a second to uplift CalSTART, who's working on a report, worked actually with Kabir, who I think might be on the call, so kudos to Kabir. They worked on a report talking about what the sum of the parts of a vehicle could be at the end of a 5-year use of that vehicle, to demonstrate that even after 5 years, there could be about 20% of the cost of the vehicle remaining in residual in the sum of the parts of that vehicle. So I think that was really interesting. But how do you take that and turn that into value to the customer? Well, For Mobility is actually putting together a residual value program where we are assuming significantly more residual value than what the market is assuming. And we're able to do that because we have the right financing parties with us to do it. A traditional bank or commercial lessor doesn't take risk in that way. And that's challenging where the industry needs financiers to be taking different kinds of risks. So For Mobility is leaning in that way to try to help customers. I'll pause there. That was kind of a lot, but pass it to Niki, or back to Ethan.
No, Niki, please. Thank you, Jackie. Appreciate it. But yeah, go ahead, Niki.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting some of sort of the new and emerging opportunities out there. Certainly, the way that Forum and others have sought to combine fueling, infrastructure, and vehicle capitalization into a complete package is one of those sort of really interesting opportunities for how financing can get done in this sector. So since Jacqueline covered it so thoroughly, maybe I'll speak to a more old school opportunity, which is simply that we've been looking also just at sort of the size of the market that is emerging here. And we've been managing the HVIP program for 13 years or so. So we've got a lot of good data on what these vehicles cost and how folks are accessing capital to finance them. So for a little bit of historical context, you can imagine that in the early days of electric vehicles, I think Dr. Steve Cliff spoke to the fact that a lot of these things were funded through sort of pilot and demo project funding. And then we had our first movers, right? A lot of big fleets making big commitments and really backing that up by investing in early models of zero emission trucks. But those were all self-financed, or very often those very large multinational corporations have easy access to capital to make these investments. Now, as we see that all of these vehicles have really reached full commercialization, so, there is now more than 100 vehicles in the HVIP catalog that you can walk in and sort of purchase from your local dealer at any time, all the major brands, all the different classes of vehicle. So now we come to this point where most people who are walking into a dealership and purchasing an electric vehicle for their medium or small business are going to be seeking lease financing or, a standard small business loan or a truck loan. And we find that, as Jacqueline mentioned, a lot of the traditional financing companies out there simply don't understand electric trucks. But I would say this, that, looking at the numbers of the volumes of electric trucks that are going to be sold in California and across the country, the amount of funding that's going to be required is enormous. So we're talking about close to $200 billion of financing that's going to be needed for these trucks, which means that if your traditional truck lenders and truck leasing companies have not yet begun to think about how they're going to structure products for this market, they're missing out on a huge market opportunity. So these are some of the sort of opportunities that I think that Kabir and Carb and I have all been working to find the numbers on, and we have a little fact sheet with sort of the data to back all of that up. So to Jacqueline's point, we have sort of two great opportunities here. We have traditional truck financing for a huge emerging market for vehicles that, from what we've been able to see, are very long-lived, do retain their value over time, and will be in high demand, and with sales numbers climbing year over year. And we have this opportunity to do more creative financing that allows you to capitalize things like also cost of fuel and infrastructure in with vehicle cost over the longer term.
Great. Thank you, Niki and Jacqueline, both, for those responses. So I appreciate that kind of overview and some of the opportunities here. Curious if you could just describe what you would see as some of the major challenges right now that are really weighing on both infrastructure deployment and financing. What are the sort of urgent needs that we have to address if we're going to make progress on this issue?
Yeah, I'll speak to the vehicle side first, and then Jacqueline maybe would like to speak to infrastructure. As I mentioned, we have lots of great first movers that are here and ready to start financing electric trucks, but we've still only really tapped the very tip of the iceberg here. There's still a huge market of traditional truck lenders and lessors who have not started to create lending products for this market. And I think that is one of the greatest challenges for me. We took our poll just here today and saw that there were not any financing companies in the room with us. So while I'm going to drop a link to the data that I think these financing companies really need to get their eyes on in order to understand sort of the market opportunity that they may be missing, it's getting that information out to them so that their leadership can begin planning for what is going to be a market transformation. And so that's a great challenge for me. Now, the way that manifests in my day-to-day life, right, is here at the HVIP program, we very often have fleets who say, yes, we're ready to make the transition to zero emission. However, we went to the folks who have given us truck leases in the past, and they were not able to write a reasonable lease. There's sort of two elements to that, right? One, the truck price is quite high, for sure. We know that. So you're financing more, and you don't have a residual value to write the lease to, which means a lot of them are trying to finance the complete cost of the truck over a very short amount of time, coming up with very high monthly lease rates. So we're collecting more data, right, to fill in that blank for residual value. And we also need to work to bring down truck costs overall, right? And that really is more of a question of economies of scale, right? As we reach economies of scale and greater battery capacity, then we believe that we're going to be bringing down the overall cost of trucks. I also think that, one of the ways to overcome that challenge is through regulation, right? We're seeing that with the regulation that's coming on board here with the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule, that will drive adoption en masse, right? So good scale there, but also it's going to begin decreasing the residual value of the diesel trucks, right? So at a certain point, diesel trucks will no longer hold the same residual value that these electric ones will in this market. So something else to think about. So approaching it from two different directions in order to get better lease products. But I think in general, we just need to expand the market for lease products and bring much more, many more lenders to the table.
Jacqueline, do you want to take that one on too?
Yeah. And like I would like to build off of Niki's point there, which is, I think that we really start to get the kind of the natural players, I would call them, of this market, the banks, the commercial lessors. We really start to get them involved when they start to see, not just data about how big the market size is, because I think that's a really great thing to highlight to them, to get them excited about what opportunity is ahead, but the data about how they price it. And that kind of directly relates to challenges with them providing credit to smaller operators, or challenges with them providing residual value, is that banks, commercial lessors, they don't take bets on things that they don't have data for, and so they need to know how to price things. And so until we can really start getting some transactions into the market, and transactions meaning fleets financed, data on how the fleets actually operate, data on operators making and meeting their monthly payments and demonstrating, building their credit, secondary market transactions. I think the sooner that we can start building the number of fleets that are actually in the market, is the sooner that we can start getting commercial lessors and banks into the market. That at least has been my experience talking with a lot of these groups. The one thing that I'll mention, is most challenging on the infrastructure side. And this is kind of a trick question, because the most challenging thing on the infrastructure side is the vehicles. It's pretty circular. We can provide cost of charging at parity or below cost of fueling, or diesel for a vehicle, but the economics are thrown out of whack when you don't have a 90% incentive bringing down the cost of that truck. So I would say, one of my largest concerns is the HVIP budget running out. I'm deeply concerned that the customer traction that we've really started to see recently, as we see that, maybe ACF is going to start to be implemented, we've seen more customer traction, and we've seen a lot of the smaller fleets financing vehicles with us. Because the economics work, because they're getting, up to 90% off of that vehicle, and that allows them to make a diesel parity economic decision, or better than diesel, and that's wonderful. But the way that For Mobility builds charging is by having some customers contracted. We need to demonstrate to our equity partners who are providing the financing that the site is going to be utilized. And, similar to kind of banks that need to see data, while we all see the writing on the wall that that zero emission is where we are going, and that battery electric is going to be one of the primary, if not the primary technology that is utilized, financiers need, have different levels of risk. Equity certainly takes more risk than debt, but even equity needs to see that traction is being made. And so something that really concerns me is, fleet HVIP financing incentives being reduced, that decreasing customer traction, and then For Mobility is not able to continue to build and develop the depots, and then we get caught in that chicken and the egg again. So one kind of point that I wanted to exemplify this is within I mentioned our Port of Long Beach facility. Amazon is the anchor tenant of that facility, which essentially means that Amazon took down a portion of the site or contracted a portion of the site with Forum Mobility. And because of that contract, Forum Mobility was able to go to our financiers and say, give us the money to build this site. And we were. And then we were able to bring, many, many more smaller fleets into that facility because we had, the credit of a larger company that was contracted for a portion of the site, and that opened it up for many more. And so, I think there's always the good intention of policy to say we're going to limit it to small fleets, and I'm very sympathetic of that in terms of the HVIP financing is what I'm referencing, but opening the opportunities for large fleets sooner, meaning if you make it so difficult for the large fleets to get access to an HVIP funding, they've got to purchase 50 vehicles before they get access to $60,000. That's not going to allow them to make a decision to, they're not going to get approval to make that decision in their own organizations. And so what I wanted to just highlight with that example is that opening opportunities for large fleets is not just opening opportunities for large fleets, it's also opening opportunities for small fleets because number one, you get more depots financed, at least in Forum Mobility's case, we get to finance more depots and that allows us to build them and then offer them to smaller fleets as well. But then just the more trucks that we get on the road, the more trucks that faster get to the level of spitting out data for financiers.
Yeah, the chicken and egg analogy is kind of perfect for this in so many ways. I mean, the infrastructure needs with the vehicle costs, and then also just that secondary market and getting the infrastructure scaled up. We've got a lot of really good questions here. I appreciate these from the audience. I'll just note too that we've got poll results as well. I don't know if everyone's able to look at these, but most of you on the line here are, well, I'd say 40% plurality. Government, we have 20% nonprofit, 20% university, roughly speaking, and charging providers, about 7%, utilities, 7%. So relatively diverse audience here in terms of perspectives. And in terms of the key challenges that you perceive, charging infrastructure, 80% of you noted that, 24% the finance issue, and challenging terms of lender financing, 14%, and lack of residual value support, 5%, and then a few longer questions. So I just wanted to reflect that. But I want to go to the questions from the audience. One question in particular was about financing the grid upgrades needed. I mean, it's one thing to finance the vehicles, and even maybe one thing to finance the charging stations themselves, but what about all the grid infrastructure that has to go, behind that meter essentially? So I don't know, Niki, if you want to weigh in on that, or Jacqueline, either one of you are welcome to take that one first.
I will turn that one to Jacqueline.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So the utilities have programs. They've got programs called EV Fleet, Charge Ready Transport. Those are kind of the SCE and PG&E programs where they will finance those upgrades for you. So if you are participating in their program, you not only get them to finance the upgrades for you, but you also get rebates towards your infrastructure itself. So you can get up to 50% of the chargers themselves financed if you participate in those programs. So ultimately that's financed by customer rates. That's kind of a different conversation, but I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you. And then we also had a number of questions around energization and what's the sort of latest there. So there's recent decision from the PUC, this one questioner noted, that might impact, but this would allow utilities to complete up to 10 years to complete the necessary grid upgrades for energizing charging stations. A question on how that would impact California's ability to achieve its freight electrification goals and mandates. There's also a question around the CPUC final decision on SB 410, AB 50, which I think is the same one, which is energization proceeding, mandating maximum timelines for new electric service requests and distribution upgrades. And basically the question is, what does that mean for the feasibility of achieving these larger goals? And this was a big issue particularly in our infrastructure convening around energization. Wondering if either of you wanted to weigh in on the CPUC recent decisions here and how that will affect the grid infrastructure deployment.
Well, I will offer an alternative perspective, which is only one that we've observed within the HFIP project, because of this question, it comes up so often, especially in public forum. You know, folks say, how are we going to accomplish this with without the infrastructure? And true, it is a challenge, but I think it is definitely a surmountable one. And Jacqueline can speak specifically to the CPUC decision. But we did some research. We looked into the last several years of HVIP vouchers, which had been canceled. And I think that there was an assumption that most likely if folks were canceling their purchase orders, their purchase requests, that it may have been because they had come up against an infrastructure challenge. In fact, the data revealed that that was a long third or fourth. It ended up coming in third or fourth position for the main reasons for cancellations. In fact, most of the folks that have been receiving HVIP vouchers and purchasing electric vehicles in California have been able to install the chargers that they need in the time that they need them. Yes, with some additional delays in some cases, but by no means sabotaging or aborting the project at all. Larger projects have longer timelines, but I've been working specifically on our small fleet program over the last year or so, where a lot of these small fleets are able to install, you know, the 2 to 5 chargers that they may need at their facility to get their vehicles operational. So I appreciate, you know, everyone taking a step back and looking at the sort of large picture of like, how big is this reach that we're going to have to accomplish to electrify all of our fleet in California? But for me, on a practical basis, looking at day-to-day purchase orders and day-to-day projects, the low-hanging fruit, you know, is certainly there, right? These fleets will have some immediate short-term mandates to integrate electric trucks into their fleet. And the power and the distribution is available there to meet that need today, and then build intelligently for the expansion that will be needed in the future.
Yeah, I will add on to that 2 things. One that I learned recently, I just find interesting, so I'm going to share it here, which is nobody really talks about, when I hear this question a lot, nobody really talks about it in the same way with data centers. So the power demand from data centers, you know, far exceeds the demand that is going to be coming from EV trucks. And I just think it's interesting that EV trucks becomes kind of the punching bag in terms of, you know, why it's going to have such demands on the grid. But it's true that it's going to, you know, we're going to need a lot of grid demand for it. You know, we've got SCE and PG&E working on it. But the other point that I mentioned here is a large amount of the grid goes unused, which is to say that sure, if you take all 20,000 trucks going in and out of the Port of Long Beach every day and say each one of those is going to be a truck that has a 450 kilowatt hour battery. And if I want to charge all of those at once, I'm going to need 10 gigawatts of load capacity. And you're like, whoa, that's a lot. But I don't think that really takes into account the reality of how trucks are going to charge, how trucks are going to move at different times. It doesn't take into account the fact that we need more grid innovations to allow us to use the grid in smarter ways. And I know these are things that the utilities are currently working on. So what I mentioned there, like, you know, if every truck is charging at the same time, you know, that what that's called is a coincident peak demand of 10 megawatts if everything was charging at the same time. But it turns out that the grid has a lot of open spots that we can plug in additional demand into the grid at that time. So let me say it this way. I mentioned that our Port of Long Beach facility has 9 megawatts of confirmed power. And that's because we entered into a contract with SCE, and they said, we can guarantee that 365 days out of the year, we're going to be able to deliver you 9 megawatts of power. But maybe 85% of the year, they could actually deliver us 15 megawatts of power. And maybe an additional, you know, 50% of the year, they could give us 20 megawatts of power. And so what I'm saying here is that the grid, you know, the current grid technology doesn't take into account kind of dynamic load hosting capacity to allow us to be able to take more off the grid that is not currently being used. So I think that's going to come out over several years. It's going to be. I'm curious and interested to see the utilities leadership as it is a big challenge from both the electric vehicles and the data centers perspective.
We're almost out of time, but there was one question here about water and wastewater fleets being hesitant to migrate to electric trucks, mainly due to concerns around reliability, particularly during a crisis. And so for that kind of specialty equipment, any thoughts in response to concerns around reliability or maybe funding to address that specific sort of critical infrastructure type needs?
Yeah, it takes me back to, again, what Steve Cliss mentioned, right, which is that the financing for these vehicles was originally demonstration and pilot, and now that these vehicles are commercialized, they're in the HVIP program, and then at some point, they will even graduate from the HVIP and not even need incentives. Specialty vehicles are certainly not there yet, and there's a few others that I can think of, things like hovercraft, as well as a lot of our heavy-duty off-road equipment, cranes, rail, all of these things. So those types of equipment, I think you'll see, like in the last CARB solicitation for the pilots and demonstration, there was a big focus on off-road. And I think that it would be important for us to think about looking for that type of funding for these extremely specialty vehicles. So in the meantime, all of us need to work to electrify what can be electrified now, right? So those are return to base, short distance operations with commercially available technology that's you can buy from your dealer today. And we should be addressing those elements of our fleet transition right away. And then with a plan to sort of get to the much more difficult to electrify emergency vehicles, specialty vehicles, off-road vehicles, and hovercraft.
All right, great. Thank you, Niki. I don't know, Jacqueline, if it's okay if you don't want to weigh in on that. One other question, we have time for it, is on uniform charging connectors and the placement of charging ports on vehicles. Do we have standardization there? Are we going to get standardization?
Standardization is coming. I know in particular they're standardizing where exactly the port goes for the megawatt charging standard. So we're still years away from megawatt charging standard being, deployed in a meaningful way, or really being even available on trucks. Because right now, there are no trucks that could accept more than 400 kilowatt hours at any given time. So I think standardization is happening, and maybe it's already occurred in a way that, as a finance person, I don't know how to speak to. But I think that's definitely on the roadmap at the very least for megawatt charging. Exactly. I think it's on the driver's side, and it's actually like in the back. So that's where it goes, and it's the same port.
Right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We still have a couple questions left. We'll try to get to those offline. I just want to thank our speakers, Jacqueline Torres, Niki Okuk, for joining us on this panel. Also want to thank Dr. Steve Cliff again, our partners at UCLA, and of course, Bank of America for sponsoring this initiative. Again, the website, climatepolicysolutions.org. We hope you do check out this report. I think some of the questions you might have will be answered in the report if you want to take a look. And otherwise, look forward to keeping in touch, and do sign up for the mailing lists of both CLEE and Emmett Institute so that you can keep up to date on not only on this report and this topic, but future reports in the series. So thank you all so much. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you to the CLEE team for your hard work on this.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Bye-bye.